Welcome Internet, the Psychologist Casual Review, and today we're going to be reviewing a very short article titled The Treatment and Rehabilitation of Sexual Offenders, written by Ronald Fairbairn in the 40s. This article is quite special in many regards because it's an article that Fairbairn wrote to inform policymakers on how to better treat and rehabilitate sexual offenders. But it's also special in that, reading it now, it is very controversial. So why so? And very quickly I'm going to explain the controversies that for him, sexual offenders and perversion is linked to basically homosexuality. So it's not just homosexuality, but he does tie the two together. A tie-in in which we would not do nowadays. And you have to understand that unfortunately, back in those days, homosexuality was still criminalized and it was seen as a mental illness, which shifted, right? I mean, we no longer think like that for, I hope, the massive part of mental health professionals see homosexuality as a completely normal form of sexuality. But back in the 40s, that was not the case. And I think we need to explain the context, and I feel the need of explaining it, that I am going to be critical of Fairbairn and his approach of homosexuality. That being said, in regards to other forms of sexual offenders, I think that what he points out in the article is still very, very relevant, and that's why I found it interesting. So, what does he say in the article? Well, in the article he explains that basically sexual offenders are not good candidates for psychotherapy and psychiatric treatment. What he explains is that because he thinks that other people see sexuality, and when I mean other people, I mean other professionals, see sexuality as a symptom, then therefore it can be treated. And he's going to go against that. He's going to say it's not a symptom. It's part and parcel, and it's a part of the core identity of the individual, of the personality, as he says in the article. Therefore, it is not treatable. It can't be like, for example, anxiety or depression changed or altered in the individual. And he feels that going there is faire fausse route, as we would say in French, i.e. we're making a mistake by trying to object change the individuals. So on this front, he was very progressive, because for him it was not a question of where one can change sexuality. It's more about trying to help the individuals understand what has happened and how not to get into legal trouble. As for him, he says that the psychotherapeutic treatment isn't impossible, but it's not, absolutely not a given. That a lot of sexual perverts will themselves be reluctant to psychotherapy, if not outright resistant. And that resistance will not allow a good therapeutic alliance, meaning that people who have these sort of inclinations do not want to change. And that not wanting to change makes them radically different from, for example, more neurotic individuals that do suffer from, for example, their depression, their anxiety. But because he says that, on the contrary, it's not something that's added on, it's not tacked on. Sexuality is as part of the individual and their psyche. Often the perverts do not want to change. What they want is to basically come forward and explain to others that they are right and that their sexuality is of importance and that they're not, absolutely should not be shamed. This is very interesting because if we put aside for a second the other sexual perversions such as zoophilia, necrophilia, and so on and so forth, we can see that this ties in incredibly interestingly enough to what has happened to the homosexual community on the whole, the LGBT, that they have turned this into pride. And that pride was already something that was seen by Fairbairn at that time, that they were already fighting to be considered normal, which is very interesting. And interestingly enough, Fairbairn does not say that they should be treated, as he feels that psychotherapy isn't necessarily the treatment by default. It's not the golden standard, and that's what he tries to transmit in this article as an idea, that it should not be treated as such. He says that what should help them is group therapy and trying to find a community, because by finding a community, they'll be able to, in a way, reintegrate themselves into the wider scope of society. And he says that basically that widening, that rehabilitation with themselves, like for example, being able to talk about what they feel, what they're experiencing, who they are, is helped by having a group that's like them. And so he stays very vague on the details. Like, he doesn't say it has to be a group of, let's say, all men on this type of sexuality, or this group of female on these types of sexualities. He doesn't give any indications. He says that there's no a priori on that. What's going to be important is to be able to basically think things through and to be able to give them a sense of community. And I found that to be incredibly modern and something that is very true for the LGBT community, which we've seen now in, let's say, the present, which is something that he saw in the 40s, was accurate. It's a continuum. Like, they were already trying to fight for their rights back in those days, and we see that they have won and need to consolidate their rights right now, right? So it's very interesting to see that basically it's a continuum, and what we see today was also present at that time. So for him, for Fairbairn, what was also important to understand is that this question of sexual perversion is not some tacked on symptom. It's not something that is there because it's there. It's there, and the person makes their identity out of it. And what he says, and I found the formulation to be quite interesting, is the pervert is not like the neurotic. The neurotic might have perverse tendencies, but that's going to create a lot of doubt, self-reflection, even sometimes self-disgust. But the pervert does not have that. He says that even if there is that, it's short-lived. What the pervert feels is a form of surplus enjoyment. So he doesn't use that word. That's the Lacanian vocabulary that will come later. This is me explaining it in the words that I feel the most accurate. But basically, for sexual perversion, it's more about triumph and about trying to prove something, and in a way making, and he says, capitalize on their perversion, i.e., like, force it, prove that it's right, that it's strong, that it's in a way perhaps even better than standard sexuality, whatever that may be. And this is a very interesting point, because in the people I have met who have had forms of sexual perversions, and here I must be very, very clear that I don't mean homosexuality. What I mean is, by perversion, is the new concept of it, the new version of perversion as we understand it from a psychoanalytic perspective, i.e., form of sexuality that does not include consent for the other. That's something that seeks domination on the other, be him someone that can't choose, an animal, an object, something that in a way asserts a form of power dynamic, and not some unison, not some will to be together, but really a relationship in which one dominates the other. And what he explains is that in the case of sexual perversions, they do not want to change that. That's not something they're looking forward to changing. That's something that they are happy with, and that they often present as being the just norm, not even normal, but the best. And I think that this is something that's very true in perversion, that often they will present what they experience as the best version of sexuality. In a way, they capitalize on their sexuality instead of just making it a part of them, but it's one part among many. It becomes the central focus. And often they try and seek to rally people to that form of sexuality. And often they also benefit from having their own communities, be it in, say, domestic circles, be it online, with, for example, everything that touches zoophilia, and so on and so forth. So I think that Fairbairn is quite accurate in what he explains, that basically they benefit from having a community, and that can help them understand where they went wrong, for example, on society in general. And for him, and this is very, very interesting, he doesn't think that prisons do much good in terms of perversions, because he feels that that's quite the opposite. Instead of making them part of a community, part again of society, rehabilitate them. It, on the contrary, pushes them to be even more isolated, even more recluse, and even more fixated on their fetish, which is a very interesting perspective and one that I have no data for, but I do tend to intellectually agree with that. That it's something in which the more you force someone into loneliness, the more you dehumanize that person, the lesser they're going to be able to compromise and find a path and a form of belonging in society in a general sense. And I found that to be very interesting. And he, at the very start of the article, explains that there is a fundamental difference between psychotherapy and rehabilitation, about treatment and rehabilitation, as he said. And basically, this form of difference is that psychotherapy is for the individual, so that the individual can heal of what is happening to them. Rehabilitation is when society decides that someone needs to be reintegrated into the system. And he says that, again, he's very nuanced on psychotherapy for sexual perversion, but he feels that there's more hope on rehabilitation and forming groups, so that groups that can help each other out in these fundamental, or the furthering of their understanding and of the limits between their behaviors and society in large. Which is very interesting, because I know through colleagues that in prisons there are a lot of group sessions that try to aim at a form of understanding. So very interesting, because at present we're still into group therapy for people with who have committed sexual offences, and that's still something that's employed. So it's very interesting to see the premises of that, because at the time when he wrote it in the 40s, it was like kind of advanced treatment, right? It was really like the spare tip, right? The modernity of it, whereas now it's more like common practice. So it's very interesting to see the roots of this common practice in basically his article. And he also, and very interestingly enough, draws a parallel between war psychoneurosis, i.e. people who were suffering from neurosis during war periods, and basically sexual offenders, saying that in both cases it's a problem that implies the group, because in both cases the group is impacted. And he explains that in the military the aim isn't to cure the individual, but to be able to make the individual part of the military group again. Part of his identity needs to basically coalesce with the group identity of the military, which he says is a bit like the sexual offender needs to reintegrate civilian life form in a more adapted way, which again, very interesting. So in this article, as I've stated, there's many ideas that are very progressive and very interesting, namely the fact that sexuality is not a symptom to be cured, and that basically it's more about rehabilitation than treatment. It's more about finding a place in society again without breaking the rules of society, and the criticism of the carceral system, which again, very early on, very, very important. But, and this is important because I think that even though Fairbairn was, I think, in my opinion, a brilliant theoretician and someone that helped us understand trauma from a psychoanalytic perspective, Stoll was a man of his time, and I think he deserves criticism for linking homosexuality in of itself, right, to perversion. And I think that that's because you might say yes, but at the time everyone thought like that. Again, no, not really, because even Freud himself said that homosexuals were not perverts. So even back in those days, it was not as cut and clean as what we might say. And I am willing to criticize Fairbairn on this idea that no, not all homosexuals are perverts. And I would even say a very, very small minority of them are. And I do believe that it's part of the normal spectrum of human sexuality. Or normal, what I mean by is a standard. It's non-harmful because it's between two consenting adults. And I think that that is the key for distinguishing normal behavior from perverse behavior, which is a domination over someone else, or the will to be hurt or to be broken beyond any play, but really physically, mentally broken. So I hope you found this video interesting. I know it's quite controversial, so I'm expecting you to be, you in the audience to have your own say on this, and that's fine. I mean, as long as you stay polite and that we can have a discussion. Please note that, and because I think this is important given the context, that I do believe homosexuality to be completely normal, in the sense that there's nothing wrong with that, and it's not something to be cured. So I just want to lay it out there so there's no confusion on my perspective on it. So basically, if you have any questions, anything you'd like to ask, feel free to do so in the comments. I'll see you in the next one.